Hi, welcome everybody to our monthly PSA online forum. And today our presenter is Slawomir Studniarz. He is one of our members at large, and he's going to have a short presentation and then we'll have questions. All right, please, Slawomir.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to present on this forum. And indeed, I have realized that I'm a member at large. I'm a member from the world at large, where there's this huge time difference. Yes, I'm not sure if you have had any members from Eastern Europe, but maybe this is one of the first cases. But okay, right. So I feel a little bit uncomfortable because I will be tooting my own horn. Like presenting myself as a translator of Poe. Well, yeah, so okay, and I guess there's no other way, yes, of doing it. So right, so I have this outline of the presentation, some prompts which I will develop. So I like to go back to the beginnings, right? And my serious engagement with post-fiction began with the doctoral dissertation, which I completed in 2001. And the first edition of Poe's Tales came out the next year. And of course, there had been a correlation here, not only in time. I must say that doing research and analyzing the Poe's stories for the purpose of my dissertation enabled me actually to tackle the texts. So I relied on my interpretations of Poe's stories. Of course, I had to read them and reread them and so many times, which proved to be a great help. And all right, so let me, of course, see if I can next share. Next, oh yeah, this, of course, the iconic portrait of Poe, our patron saint, yes, so to speak. Right, so this is the first edition, 2002. It was a very handsome edition, hardcover, very carefully prepared. And it was part of the prestigious publication series, and it was part of the canon of world literature series. So, I think it was kind of elevating, yes, for Poe's stories to be published in this particular publication series. And it was followed by the softcover edition a few years later, then again, the third edition, which was hardcover, 2012, and the collection originally included 29 stories. Okay, so here we have the list, 29 stories, yes. You can see the titles. And of course, what were the reasons for selecting these stories, right? You can see that they very much represent the core of Poe's, let's say, Gothic writing, yes, detective writing. So the idea was to translate the most representative stories by Poe, the ones that he's famous for. Of course, there was here this implicit idea of Poe's canonical tales, yes? So the idea of what exactly constitutes Poe's canon. And so I think that was a safe selection, but there are certain omissions, and I want to comment on these omissions later on. But strangely enough, some of the stories in this selection, the original selection, had been virtually unknown to the Polish reader they had never been anthologized in the earlier editions in the second half of the 20th century. The reception of Poe's fiction goes back to the turn of the 19th century and the 20th century. The publication by various magazines, and I think that lots and lots of Poe's texts had been published by various magazines. But in the 1920s, I think there appeared two volumes, two independent translations. And in the second half of the century, there was another edition, a new one, which was, I think, very much authoritative, establishing Poe's sort of canon for the Polish reader, right? But still, you know, there have been sort of striking omissions, and the most glaring examples of this neglect are, for instance, such stories as Morella, virtually unknown to the Polish reader in the second half of the 20th century, or The Island of the Fae, A Tale of the Ragged Mountains, or The Domain of Arnheim. Yes, a very important story, I think, for Poe. And I had arranged these stories in a certain order, and there's this progression. I think that you can notice more or less the pattern from the Gothic gloom, yes, Berenice, Morella, Ligeia, The Fall of the House of Usher, then this slight sort of modulation of the mood. We have A Tale of the Ragged Mountains, A Descent into the Maelstrom. There we have the detective tales, and then we have the angelic dialogues, and finally the volume was sort of completed by this tale, which I take to be this tale of artistic transcendence. I think is, for me, one of the most important texts by Poe. I wanted to show this sort of progression, so to speak, which in Poe's vision from this bleakest, darkest sort of mood to that sort of more triumphant, where the story that affirms, you know, the power of art. So, well, as you can notice the prevalence of serious stories, right? So the idea was to keep the mood more or less unified, right? So you won't find here comic tales. I think that the only case possibly is the oblong box, which is, well, it's not comic on the surface, but it is a strange story, in fact, but hard to classify. So yes, I had excluded his grotesques, his satires. Well, I thought that these sort of called for another volume, yes, to complete. We have the one volume concerned with his tales of the arabesque and you know, analytical tales. So I had not really tackled his grotesques or satires. There were other significant omissions. I put aside the text that at the time had posed a challenge that I thought was insurmountable. I mean, I felt sort of intimidated, yes, by these texts for some reason. I think I was intimidated, for instance, by the complexities and convolutions of the mystery of Marie Roget. It's a very long text and very complex, difficult, really. And I will comment on translating this text later on. So I didn't feel sort of yet up to it. My career as a translator began in the early 1990s. So I translated Poe's stories, well, having a decade of experience as a translator. And perhaps this was still not enough for such texts as The Mystery of Marie Roget. Or the cryptography in the gold box scared me away. I mean, like I felt really perplexed, and I thought, how to, translate, all those ciphers and symbols and the text recovered from those from this parchment. So yeah, I put aside these texts, and also initially I mean, from the start I distanced myself from the older traditional translations, well established, for instance, by Bolesław Leśmian, a famous poet in the 1920s, or the other one by Stanisław Wyrzykowski. Well, these translations had been created in the early decades of the 20th century, and to me they sound archaic. This was my impression when I turned to these translations. I thought that they did not represent Poe. I think, well, this is my view of Poe. Of course, Poe is your native writer, and I think that if you look at his text from the linguistic point of view, you may have a different sort of perspective. But for me, Poe, his prose is modern. Of course, it is Gothic, but when I read it, I don't see a kind of distance that would place Poe's text in some remote epoch. They are written in the 1830s, 40s, but it's like there's nothing archaic about them, unless he consciously sort of chose to in some of his texts, right? So these translations by the older translators didn't sound adequate. They were too archaic. In many cases, I thought they were stylistically remote from Poe's prose. To give you, what were the consequences? For instance, Wyrzykowski's translation of Asher places the action almost in the medieval times. Yes, he translates the details in the background, like almost referring to squires. Yes, instead of a valet, yes, he has a squire. Like almost like the narrator is a knight arriving, at the castle, like a Gothic castle. This kind of, and also some other, he uses some other words which sounded, I think, dated and old-fashioned already in the 1920s. So I thought that was not right. These translations, I often found that they were inaccurate. Well, of course, I cannot compare my situation. I am privileged. We are all now privileged because we have access to the internet. And the internet is a treasure of information. And Poe's phrases, Poe's expressions are sometimes so obscure that you really cannot trace their origin, and you are defeated in the end. I mean, for instance, I have been defeated by this reference to the wine, the antelope wine that ordered by who was it? The one who was killed, Mr. Shuttleworthy in Thou Art the Man. So the reference to the type of wine that I think he just invented, and you cannot really find any source. But in many other cases, we can access, yes, some databases, or we can find the usages. So nowadays translators are in a much better position. They have really powerful tools. So these translators in the 1920s in Poland had to struggle with Poe's text, relying on some, Polish English dictionaries, which I don't know, I cannot really, comment on their value, but sometimes they must have proved of little help. So I think that it was sort of necessary to redress this situation and try to, correct those inaccuracies, or sometimes simply mistranslations. The mistranslations, for instance, in the Gold Bug by Wyrzykowski, where this text relies on so many descriptions, topographical descriptions of directions, etc. And I think that some of these had been somehow misunderstood by Wyrzykowski, or for instance, another problem was the translation of The Fall of the House of Usher by Leśmian, the other translator. Leśmian is a wonderful poet, and again, it was kind of intimidating, to compete with Leśmian as a translator of Poe. But I have found recently that his translation, for instance, of The Fall of the House of Usher had been based on Baudelaire's version. I mean, if I compared the opening passages, and Leśmian had repeated exactly the same mistakes that Baudelaire committed when translating The Fall of the House of Usher. So I think that Leśmian probably didn't understand English well, so he relied on the French edition. So now you understand the situation, right? That there is this tradition in Poland that shows Poe in this light, somehow determined by these two translators. And but these translations also bear the stamp of the aesthetic movement, which is called Młoda Polska. It was at the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century, the 20th century movement. Młoda Polska, it was a kind of neo-romantic, decadent aesthetic movement, very characteristic. And these Leśmian, Wyrzykowski, were sort of influenced by the aesthetics of this movement. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they in their translations, I find something that is sort of strange to Poe. Maybe you think the opposite as native speakers of English, but in these translations by Wyrzykowski and Leśmian, I find the near hysterical tone, which you may say, well, it's all right. You find that this is Poe, this near history, but I think that is overdone in many tales that really do not reach this intensity. But this near hysterical tone, this is clearly the legacy of the Młoda Polska movement, this exaltation, yes, the rhetorical flourish, this tendency to ennoble, yes, the language, pathos, the tendency to the hyperbolic. I mean, well, those who criticize Poe may find, these are the marks of Poe's style. But I disagree. I think that Poe's style is very flexible, and I think that there's this excellent study by Brett Zimmerman that analyzes Poe's style, and it shows how that he wrote in so many different styles, right? Okay, so the conclusion was at this stage that my translations were to be modern, the beginning of the 21st century, but still I wanted to retain the elegance, the sophistication of the originals. And I wanted my translations to be precise, but atmospheric, right, at the same time. And the additional challenge was translating Poe's ballads, which are included in the 3 stories in the collection, right? The three ballads which are crucial, especially Ligeia on the Fall of the House of Usher. They're crucial for the plot of these stories. And in the assignation to One in Paradise, so that was another challenge, right, to translate these poetic texts. And for instance, to One in Paradise, one of the Russian poets of the turn of the century, I think it was Bauman, thought that To One in Paradise was the most beautiful lyric ever written. Yes, To One in Paradise, for instance, he was full of praise about it. So this was sort of an additional challenge, yes, to convey, to offer something that would, be also perceived by Polish readers as, beautiful, compelling, right? But also the idea to be true to the meaning, especially in the Fall of the House of Usher, yes, the precise rendering of the imagery, or in Ligeia, the Conquer Worm, which is also very precise in this is a compact, statement on the human condition, which needs to be sort of preserved for this poem to make sense in the context of the whole story, right? And I didn't want to rely on the older translations, so I had to offer my own. So this is the first stage. But then I was, after some time, nearing the second decade of the 20th century. The edition of Poe went out of circulation, roughly speaking, in 2014. The publishing office was no longer interested in reissuing this volume, so I asked them to transfer the rights to me. So I regained the copyrights, and I approached another publishing house. It was in 2018, I think 2019, something like that. And they agreed, but they wanted more stories. Well, it was a kind of marketing strategy to offer Polish readers something new, not just, to reissue the known volume, but to encourage them to buy the new one, which let me see, is it here? Okay. Yeah. So the new edition, right? So I was asked to provide 10 more stories. So this is the latest revised and expanded edition, finally published in 2021. It was delayed by 1 year because of the pandemic. They didn't want to risk, and they waited just for 1 year. And this is a very handsomely prepared volume, hardcover, good quality paper, and the quality of print, everything. So it's really an edition that sort of pleases also the touch. I mean, you want to hold it in your hand. I mean, it's really very nice. So I was now somehow obliged to add, I decided, to add 10 more stories for this planned, more comprehensive volume, and which contains, as you can see, 39 stories. So it is probably the most comprehensive selection of Poe's short fiction in Polish to date, right? The new tales, which were these, right? The 10 new stories added to the 2021 volume, which has this a bit pompous title, which is not mine, yes? Opowiadania prawie wszystkie, the almost complete stories, right? Opowiadania prawie wszystkie. Of course, Poe scholars know that 39 stories maybe represents half his output, yes, of short fiction, but the almost complete stories, I think, again, is kind of very catchy. So these are the new tales: The Gold Bug, King Pest, Messengerstein, Hopfrog, The Mystery of Marie Roget, Eleonora, Silence, A Fable, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, Thou Art the Man, and A Predicament. Right? Some of these stories are the ones that previously sort of had intimidated me. So now I decided sort of to accept the challenge. So, well, but also the decision was also motivated by the need to redress the previous imbalance by including comic stories, King Pest, right? The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, and, well, a Predicament, which is a kind of, it is a comic story, which is, well, which is a macabre story, but which has this, filled with very black humor, but still it is humorous, right? But it's a very peculiar brand of humor. I wanted to complete the Dupin trilogy, right? So the Mystery of Marie Roget, to present the 3 Dupin tales. I also wanted to extend Poe's detective output for the Polish reader by translating Thou Art the Man, which is also a detective story. I think unjustly neglected. I think there are 4 detective tales. The narrator of Thou Art the Man is a detective. And I think it anticipates one of the modern genres of detective fiction, not the classic, whodunit, a kind of a puzzle solving plot, but this is concerned with the whole legal process, the tampering with evidence. We have Charlie Goodfellow who plants the evidence to incriminate someone. We have the narrator who wants to protect the innocent man, so it sort of plays a trick. So it's a different story, but still, I think it is a detective story. I wanted to rectify the errors of the previous translation of the Gold Bug, those factual errors, make sure that everything sort of checks out, so to speak. But also, I wanted to reinstate the Gold Bug is, the Gold Bug is a comic story, of course. It is a comic story, and I wanted to reinstate the comedy, which is in the Gold Bug, but which had been lost in the previous translation by Wyrzykowski. The comedy, I think, is shown through this humorous wordplay. This humorous wordplay especially shines through the remarks by Jupiter. Jupiter remarks who are off the mark, of course. Yes, he's off the mark with retorts, which are sort of completely miss the point. But these instances of pun had been completely lost in translation. I want to show you, an example of these retorts, yes, which are off the mark, but they are very humorous. Yes, the antennae are. There ain't no tin in him, Massa Will. I keep on telling on you, right? That's one interjection by Jupiter. The bug, I'm very certain that Massa Will been bit somewhere but the head by Gold Bug. And what cause have you, Jupiter, for such a supposition? Claws enough, Massa, and mouth too. Right, so I think that these are rare instances in Poe's fiction where he plays with words in dialogues, yes, in this way. And I think it was worth sort of the candle to try and reinstate this kind of wordplay, which sort of adds to the value of the story, right? Now, so this is the background that I have wanted to sketch, and now I'd like to tell more about the experience of translating Poe. Yes, and so since the first publication in 2002, my appreciation of an insight into Poe's texts grew. I also gained more proficiency as a translator. I was busy translating his books and stuff. I have to my credit also one novel by Toni Morrison, her first novel, The Bluest Eye, the last novel by Il Doctorow. But okay, this is not well. I'm saying this because yeah, I think that my skills as a translator sort of improved, and it was an important factor. But I think not the most important. The decisive factor was my research on post poetry. It was in view of my dissertation, which, well, habilitation, right? Schrift. If you understand the German or the Spanish system, we have this dissertation. Well, after the doctoral dissertation, later on, you are expected to produce another dissertation, right? So I undertook this research on post poetry, but my approach to post poetry was phonosemantic. That is, the relation between sound and meaning in his poems. And this made me more sensitive to the sound patterning and in post-fiction, the verbal texture of post-fiction as well, not only his poetry, but somehow my work on poems somehow opened my eyes to the dimensions of his prose. So all these considerations, yes, led me to realize that my first efforts required a careful inspection, right? To see if any revisions were in order. And this time I now was aware that it was absolutely necessary to compare my translations against Mabot's copy texts, yes, as those authoritative editions. And there are certain discrepancies, between various versions, and sometimes, yeah, there are factual errors. There are stories when we have. I think in Morella we have one instance that I have found that there is kind of in one of post versions there is an error which is sort of rectified in some later edition. So yes, so I reread my previous translations. I read post texts, and well, luckily, not all these texts really required revision, but some stories really had called for a second look, for some amendments. So, which stories have been revised? Why? In what ways? Well, first of all, the Fall of the House of Usher. I think that this is Poe's masterpiece. I think it's his central text. I mean, for me, that of course, according to me, this is Poe's central text. I mean, and it's beautifully written, and this is the first story by Poe I have translated, and I felt that my translation needed revamping, and I wanted to give justice to the intricate verbal layer of the text. Now I wanted to render, those most conspicuous instances of dense sound patterning. So, for instance, here, yes, the inaccuracies in the Goldbug. I think there is this terrible case. I'm not sure if you have really tried to count the number of these symbols against the text. There are curious discrepancies, and also in various editions, the arrangement of these marks, the number of them sort of varies. So really, this required me to dig in and really make a list. I had to make a list and calculate if that is right, and sometimes. I needed sort of to correct, to add some symbols to make it right. the fall of the House of Usher, yes, to render the most conspicuous instances of dense sound patterning. For instance, the opening. This is just one example, which already, you know, in the opening sentence, yes, sort of alerts the reader to this patterning of sound during the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day. So we have the play on these sounds, yes, DRL, DL, DR, DLD, during the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day. So this is really very, very elaborate. And this is something that I missed in my first translation. So I decided to redress this. And yeah, I offered something equivalent, późną październikową porą, right? Or nisko zawisłą, chmur ponure, right? So to introduce sort of, so, you know, echoes and the variations on various sounds, not the same sounds, but to introduce some kind of a patterning, which I think is important. Another passage which I thought absolutely deserved to be rendered in this manner was the conclusion of, another example from The Fall of the House of Usher. I'm not sure if you can see it. There was an iciness, a sickening iciness, sinking, sickness, and iciness, right? Again, you have this very careful patterning of SN, sickening, iciness, and sinking, right? So I also tried to introduce a kind of patterning based on different consonants. Jest na porażonym, sercu legło, lodowaty, posępne, strapienie, right? So to compensate somehow for the patterning of the original, but there's a passage that absolutely deserved, and this is the conclusion. The conclusion of the Mask of the Red Death. And one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of the revel, yes? Revelers revel, but dropped blood-bedewed, yes? So you can, and died each in the despairing, the continuation of D, of his fall, and the life, yes? Life reflects fall, life of the ebony clock went out with the last gay, and the flames of the tripods expired. Yes, tripods expired. And the final sentence, which is absolutely marvelous, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. So, yeah, so the idea here is that here the last sentence, this dominion, yes, of darkness, decay, Red Death, is shown by the configuration of these sounds, yes, including D, R, right? So I think that it was absolutely necessary to try and render this in Polish, and I have offered the following. Before, of course, legli rażeni swawolnicy zbroczonym krwią, so w-ry, zastygł, zamarł, wesołków wygasł. But the last sentence, i objęły niepodzielne władanie nad wszystkim, czerw, mrok i czerwony mur, right? Czerw, mrok, czerwony mur. So this is very, very tightly sort of bound together, yes, I mean sonically. So for the effect of the story, I think it is crucial, yes, to end on this note. But well, that was not all. I mean, simply a new perspective also required clarification of meaning in some cases, yes, as in the ending of Murders in the Rue Morgue, like, which is, for instance, this sentence, I thought I somehow mistranslated. I didn't get the idea the first time. Nevertheless, that he failed in the solution of this is by no means that matter for wonder that he supposes it. It's a very convoluted sentence. Oh, that very problematic phrase, one master stroke of Kant. Kant is a certain key word in Poe's sort of vocabulary, Kant, right? He uses it also in his essays. Very hard to find something equivalent to Kant. Okay, and generally, I wanted to reinforce the verbal sophistication of Dupin. So I looked again at the translation also of the Pearl-Linked Letter. Right, and which leads me to the next point, and one more before I go on. I mean, there is this the opening passage of The Fall of the House of Usher, and you have the narrator gazing at the reflection of the estate, and first, when seeing the house for the first time, he remarks on the vacant and eye-like windows, and then he looks at the reflection of the house and he almost repeats verbatim the phrase, the vacant and eye-like windows. I think this is very important. So any translator, to give justice to Poe's text, needs to preserve, this one-to-one correspondence, that the same, almost exactly the same phrase needs to be used in the second time. Okay, I now want to talk about the pitfalls and the rewards involved in translating Poe's stories. Not for long. I'm approaching, well, the end of my presentation. So what are the pitfalls involved in translating Poe's stories? Well, this issue is demonstrated particularly well by the mystery of Marie Roget. For a translator, it is probably the most ungrateful text in his entire output. It is dense, convoluted, with multiple embeddings and mediations. The plot is very thin, a pretext really for unfolding, subtle philosophical speculations on parallels or coincidences between two realities, or two series, or two branches of series of events. This is also a kind of occasion for including lectures on the role of chance in the pursuit of truth and the like. So it is really very hard to keep up with Poe here, especially in the beginning, in the opening sections of Marie Roget, in the conclusion. This poet is most abstract, most elusive. It's really hard to reach that level of, I don't know, reasoning that he presents. To give an example, for instance, this, a very difficult one, but it's not yet the worst one yet. But yeah, this is an example of his concerns, yes, and the level of abstraction, the level of subtlety. I think it's also formidable. And so what is it like to translate Poe? What are its rewards? Well, in a final analysis, translating Poe's text is a source of delight for me. His texts grip me. They compel my mind to go into overdrive, yes. And it's impossible to maintain a professional detachment while translating Poe's stories. It is a passion. And that is why I so eagerly embraced the proposal, yes, to prepare this new volume. It is like climbing the Himalayas, the pains and difficulties of the ascent are recompensed by the view arising at the end. And the final effect, yes, is a reward in itself. And one last sentence, that you do not outgrow Poe. Contrary to what Henry James, yes, and after him, T.S. Eliot said, you do not outgrow Poe. Only your perspective changes. You discern still new levels of his carefully crafted and carefully reasoned writing. So thank you very much for your attention, and maybe there's time now to do something else. I will stop sharing the screen.
All right, thank you so much. We have, hopefully you're able to see the virtual applause and and such. So, okay, I've enabled the chat box if you'd prefer to type in a question or comment rather than speak it. Otherwise, if you have any questions, you can use the raise hand feature or just raise your hand. Thank you so much for your presentation. And who'd like to get us started with questions and comments?
Okay.
Jeff, go ahead.
So I see you listed a predicament. I wonder, did you include the introductory How to Write a Blackwood article, or did you omit that?
I omitted it. I wanted to just add the story that illustrates. Yeah, I know that. Well, it's kind of.
Does the story really make sense without the introduction? I mean, some of the jokes rely on the fact that she's badly using the advice that she has been given.
Yes, I think that you're right. But still, I think the story also makes sense on its own. That maybe it's a bit. There's certain allusions, are lost, but these original allusions included in How to Write a Blackwood article can be decoded by American readers, but also those who know the cultural literary context. Yes, the Poe's so to speak dealings with Emerson and his circle. So I think How to Write a Blackwood article is a text which is much more obscure to the Polish reader. But whereas I think a predicament is an enjoyable story on its own, right? I think so.
Do you have introductions of your own to the stories that would give them a little context?
I should have mentioned this. For my first edition, I wrote a long afterward. Running up to almost 20 pages, expanding on Poe's work and how important post-fiction is, how unjust is his assessment, by some critics and etc. Trying to elevate Poe's status to like he's not just a writer of popular fiction, right? So yeah, I have written. Afterwards for most of these editions, and plus the latest one, and I have explained a predicament in my the following note. Yes, from me as a translator, I sort of talked about this particular story. Okay, I have a question. How many translators? Yes, I think that one translator, Bolesław Leśmian, this excellent poet, that he was probably not familiar with the originals, or his English was not adequate, so he relied on Baudelaire. Wyrzykowski did, I think, use the original texts. The earliest translation of the two volumes by Wyrzykowski and Leśmian appeared in the 1920s, more or less, and they had for a long time they had become sort of the benchmark. Yes, so to speak. I don't know, the standard somehow. And my attempt was probably one of the first attempts to offer modern translations. There was another which was simultaneously published also, but it was not really well received. It was not noticed. I said that I will be tooting my own horn, but my translation of Poe had been noticed by the journal Literature in the World, Literatura na Świecie, and was awarded. So yes, which was to me kind of very important. I felt sort of reassured, sort of encouraged as a translator, and there are these two old translations, and I think two contemporary ones, one by me and the other by Jarosław Śmietana, but he offers only a very narrow selection. And he does not translate poems. He uses the old translations of the poems.
Slawomir, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Which of the stories or poems, if any, were the most enjoyable for you to translate from English to Polish?
Enjoyable.
Yes. If any.
Some fun, yeah. I mean, enjoyable in the sense which stories proved
maybe
fun.
easiest, or just there were some pleasant ways the languages work together that might have been unexpected, or
there are two kinds of stories, of course. There are those serious stories, and there are comic stories. They work in completely different ways. And I think that I enjoyed translating a predicament, which is really so hilarious and so inventive. And Poe had invented nonsense verse before Hilaire Belloc. I think that we find the distortions of, Psyche Zenobia pretending her erudition and, mutilating the verses. That was great fun to translate Psyche Zenobia generally. That Poe's treatment of whoever the model was, well, is cruel and hilarious at the same time. But there are of course, well, they follow the House of Usher, obviously, for its language. Yeah, I think the Tale of Heart. Yeah, I mean. But there is one which I don't really appreciate, I must admit. That's Metzengerstein. I think there is something wrong with this story. And I think it is only acceptable as a parody. But I tried to find any, sources that would confirm this, that Poe intended this as a parody. Maybe someone is aware, but I think that, it's so improbable. But the fact that we have those two castles by two aristocrats, and they could see almost each other's, they can look into each other's windows. Yes, so this is something really implausible, right? So this is a difficult story, a bit sort of awkward. Yeah, I think it's not Poe at his best, definitely.
And just a quick follow-up: which story are you proudest of having translated, or feels the most like a triumph for you?
I think it would be The Fall of the House of Usher. I wouldn't really hesitate here in pointing out this particular story. Yeah.
Thank you. Jeff has another question, please.
First, a comment, since you just asked about Metzengerstein. That is one of the tales of the Folio Club, so it's not necessarily a parody of any particular story, but it's sort of a stylistic thing, as each of the tales is kind of a hybrid parody homage. But for the Gold Bug, I wonder, how do you deal with Jupiter's dialect, which of course is very stylistic. It's very stereotypical, we would say today, but in Poe's era, that would have been how people saw Black servants, particularly speaking. Not very flattering, but probably at least what most white readers would have expected. And then the translation of the cryptogram, which is so much based on the occurrence of specific characters in English, which I assume does not really correlate in Polish.
Right. So, yeah, I think that needs to be preserved. I mean, that the text that is recovered is in English. There is no other way. I mean, of doing it. That's why it discouraged me from translating the Goldbach in the first place back into the early 2000s, because I didn't really know how to approach this question, really. But as for Jupiter, I think that yes, there's this. He speaks with this very, very heavy dialect, but I think that there is a lot of humanity in the portrayal of Jupiter. He's not a he's not a fool. I mean, he's clever in some ways, and I think that, well, his portrayal, I'm not sure if it's racist or not, but I think that there's a lot of that it's sympathetic, and but the language of Jupiter, I need to, in Polish, I have to rely on the difference between the educated speech, the uneducated speech, the village dialect, right, and the grammatical, errors and errors in pronunciation. So this kind of thing, right, to render Jupiter's speech.
And when Poe does dialect, he does sometimes do, I forget what the appropriate name is for it, but he does sort of cheating dialect where the spelling looks quirky, but the pronunciation is actually the same as the word, which doesn't really truly work as dialect, but it sort of does when you read it. But if you hear it, it doesn't actually work. So you actually are keeping the cryptogram itself is in English. Do people appreciate the patterning that we would from, we kind of know that the letter E is very common in English. Does that concept translate if you're not dealing with?
I would have to get the book, but I think, yeah, I mean, I have to translate this. I mean that the remarks of it's about the occurrence of the specific sounds of the letters of alphabet in the English language.
So that keeps you from having to, you don't have to come up with symbols that are different than Poe's, because you kept Poe's language and the cryptogram in English, essentially, and the translation of the English into symbols.
Yeah, but later, of course, the English text is translated. Yes, once it's recovered from these symbols, then it is translated. I think it's a reasonable way. I mean, otherwise you'd have to devise a different text. It would be this would be something else. It would be like rewriting the Goldbach, really. But it is a text written by an English-speaking writer about the cryptogram, the cipher, which is in English. So I think we cannot really alter it. Yes.
I didn't see you listing it, The Devil in the Belfry, but would you translate something like Wundervatimitis, which is a Germanic sounding English joke?
Yeah. I mean, yes, it's how Germans or the Dutch, yes, pronounce English sounds, especially they miss a w sound. Something equivalent, of course, the compensation. You cannot reproduce the same, distortion, but the idea of equivalent effect, I think, yes, to show to show it through something else, some other linguistic sort of or pronunciation factor.
And your
but
basic
the
copy
stories are extremely difficult, and I don't know, they still intimidate me. Those jokes, in the comic stories that I have left out, they are still very, very challenging.
poetry would be hard enough. Humor seems like it would be even harder. You use Mabbit as the copy text?
Yes, something indicated on the website as Mabbit's copy text. Yes.
Paul, did you have a question or comment? Okay, sorry, I just saw you. Okay, I see that, Richard, one moment, we have somebody in the chat, and I'll go there first. Stephen Rock.
Yeah, it's a comment. It's a comment by
about Devil in the Belfry there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, yeah. Go ahead, Richard. Oh,
No.
you're muted. Sorry, still muted.
Okay. Thank you. Great job. I wanted to ask, how does the reception of your translations of Poe say something about the nature of Polish culture today?
Post culture.
Polish culture today.
Polish culture.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating story because unexpectedly the publication of this volume turned out to be quite an event, right? It had been noticed by the media, by there were press releases, you know, which is completely, you know, surprising to me. The official release that, you know, the publication of Post Stories. I was invited to speak twice on the radio about these translations. I gave an interview which was published in the journal on the internet, and then even I was invited to a podcast, you know, which is available. I kind of 40 minutes talk about Poe, yeah, I mean, there was this unusually warm and eager reception, so to speak, which is surprising, and I wonder why. Well, Poe is popular in Poland. I mean, among the American Romantic writers, Poe really stands out. There's this long tradition that goes back, as I said, to Młoda Polska, the turn of the century. Whereas such writers as Hawthorne probably are you know, almost unknown. Yes, Hawthorne is unknown in Poland for some reason, right? But the popularity of Poe, about the Polish culture nowadays, I wondered about it. Maybe his stories offer some kind of release or escape. That, you know, they are so attractive in this way that they engross the reader, and you know, you can project yourself into these worlds, imaginary worlds, and maybe yes, I don't know what else to say.
Okay, thank you.
I've noticed, Slawomir, I noticed that you have translated, you mentioned Toni Morrison, I think Beckett as well, Samuel Beckett, and maybe some other writers who work with the, you know, who are writing in English. How do they compare to one another? Is it just like starting anew with each writer? Because they're obviously different time periods.
I've used the website, I mean, the only official website, which is eapo.org. Yes, so that's the website that I've, you know, consulted hundreds of times. Really.
Oh, Jeffrey's question, yeah.
Yeah, the first choice that you turn to. I didn't actually translate Beckett. I wrote a few articles on his poetry.
Okay.
And continuing my interest in Poe's poetry, I wanted to, you know, somehow try my hand and some other poet, yeah. So my interest in poetry, yeah. So somehow from Poe extended to Beckett and other writers. Yeah, a whole range of writers. I mean, not all of them are famous or, you know, classics, but you know, but this part of my sort of career is over. I no longer translate. I mean, I find it too exhausting, really.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
So I have a comment and another question. Although you've I don't know, headed me off at the pass there with your statement that you're no longer translating. I was going to ask you if you have plans to translate Poe's poetry into English. You made a comment, I mean, into Polish. You made a comment earlier that that your reading of Poe's poetry informed your appreciation of the poetic language of his prose writing. And as you know from Baudelaire, the only poems of Poe that Baudelaire translated into French were the ones that were embedded in other works, ones that you've mentioned. But given your appreciation for poetic language and your appreciation in particular of Poe's poetry, do you have plans to translate his poetry? And if so, what particular challenges do you see ahead of you?
Well, I think it would be a very sort of enticing project, yes, to try my hand on Poe's poetry. But again, I see those enormous challenges. And for instance, the market with the Raven is so crowded. I mean, that can you really offer something new? Some more brilliant way of translating Nevermore? I mean, here you're stuck. Yes, your choices are so limited. So about the Raven, for instance, right? But there have been quite a few translations of the Raven. In fact, 5 or 6, even contemporary ones, a few of them. But then the other poems, for instance, Eulalie or Annabel Lee, they had once been translated early in the early 20th century. And these translations are not really successful because they try to render sort of like the story which is in a poem, as it were, sort of. But I think that it's necessary here to notice the sound patterning, and without it, I mean, it will be a kind of a failure. If so, yeah. But this requires really a dedication, right? Benedictine, I think, Benedictine dedication. It would be a kind of task that you would, it's not something that someone will commission you to do within, I don't know, like some. Yeah, but well, I do not really exclude this, since I have myself started writing poems both in English and in Polish, and I find writing poetry in English easier than in my native tongue somehow. But also I have some, when I write a poem in English, I want some poems, I want to make them available to my Polish friends, so then I translate them, and sometimes I'm not really pleased, or the other way around. Yes, so I can see on my own example how difficult translation is, and all translation involves loss, really.
I think Baudelaire would agree.
Loss is the highest in poetry.
Yeah, I think Baudelaire would agree. I think he had such respect for Poe's poetry that he simply refused to translate Poe's poetry into French. And if anyone could have translated it, if anyone had that kind of sympathetic understanding of Poe's poetics, Baudelaire did, but because of the respect, he refused to translate those poems, except the ones he absolutely had to translate in the certain works, and the one that Poe wrote to his mother-in-law.
Right, well, because these poems inserted in the tales, they make sense sort of as narratives. They work as narratives to some extent, right? So they function within this larger context. But you may sort of render their sort of message, yes. I mean, whereas if you take such poems as I say, Eulalie, for instance, I mean, what kind of story is it? I mean, it's so repetitive in a way, yes. Like, and it's extremely difficult.
Yeah, so much of the sense of the poem is in the sound of the poetry.
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
So it is almost impossible to render it well.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good
Mhm.
presentation today.
Thank you.
Slawomir, I think Jacqueline, did you have a question? Was it? No, she did. Okay, just checking in. Bill, go ahead, please.
Bill has a question.
Yes.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you. And I want to speak in favor of Metzengerstein really quickly. I'm not mad at you. I understand why you want to see it as a parody, which is fine. In connection with some other things I teach, I've been reading Marie de France, who wrote in Anglo-Norman. And one of the classic tales she translates is L'Hospice. The knights whose houses are right next to each other, they could see in the windows. And so that got me thinking, and I started doing a checklist of all of Marie de France sort of laundry list of these already old Gothic Norman, real Gothic tropes. And that's where I think, so maybe it is a little bit of a parody, but Poe likewise, I think, is using this already existing understanding of what do you need to make this tale fit the traditional Gothic modality. So,
Okay.
and I think he would have known that when in the early French, but I can't prove he knew Marie de France. Anybody know?
Yeah. Thank you, Bill. But I know that there is the one of his tales once was subtitled "A Tale in the Imitation of Germanic." Is this the one? Metzengerstein?
Yes, yeah. And it begins with the terror. Yeah, right.
A tale in imitation
of the German. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway,
Right.
thank you.
Yeah. Slawomir, thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you very much.
This, I think, for me, I'll speak for myself. I had no clue. I had a sense, but no clue of just the depth of the difficulties in translation, and it is not for the faint of heart.
Telescope is one of the more complex and technologically advanced pieces of equipment mankind has ever built.
I don't know what's happening. I got somebody's ad, I think. Sorry, that was not me. But if we had some interference there. But I was just going to say, you know, I'm so pleased that the Polish readers will have some access to Poe. And again, thank you so much for the presentation. Wish everybody, yeah, I wish everybody happy holidays. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here.
Mm-hmm.